Hi, I'm Greg Hunter. This is the weekly news wrap-up for Friday, August 9th, 2013. And I'm coming to you from the Midwest, and I have some pretty good news for you. Look at the soybeans behind me. They're about belt high, and it's a lot different than last year. Last year we had a terrible drought. This year we had a lot more water than we needed, but the crops are still doing pretty good. Also, take a look at the corn here in my hand. I remember holding up a ear of corn that didn't have hardly any, kernels on it. This is a small ear, and look at that, nice and uniform and beautiful. And this means that the crops will be doing much better this year than last. Now, that said, a professional farmer buddy of mine here in the Midwest says, well, because of the late planting that a lot of farmers got, we'll get a late harvest, and that could involve, catching some sort of a frost, which could hurt yields, especially in the upper Midwest. Now, we still have drought conditions west of Missouri, places like the Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and parts of Texas, extremely dry. My estimation, about 40% of the country still extremely dry. That said, we still are having a pretty good year for crops. Let's hope we don't catch a frost, and that'll drive up food prices. Next up, a key summit between Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama has been canceled. Why? Because of the Edward Snowden whistleblower situation that Russian granted Edward Snowden asylum. And the Obama administration is mad as heck, and they canceled this summit. Now, one of the main things they needed to talk about was the Syrian civil war. It's claimed the lives of 100,000 Syrians. It's been going on for more than 2 years. The U.S. is backing the al-Qaeda rebels in Syria. Russia and Vladimir Putin is backing Hezbollah and the Assad regime, and they were hopefully going to reach some type of a diplomatic end to the Syrian civil war. Now, the two parties that are funding both sides are not talking. It's because of Edward Snowden. Vladimir Putin, shot back and said, hey, listen, this Snowden situation is caused by the United States. A very ominous development in the Middle East when the two major powers are not talking. And speaking of the Middle East, the U.S. has, closed down, at least temporarily, nearly 24 embassies. Why? Because of an al-Qaeda terror threat. And this is unbelievable. We're arming al-Qaeda in Syria, and we're afraid of al-Qaeda and closing down nearly 24 embassies all over the Middle East. Also, this past week, we had a drone strike where we knocked out 4 al-Qaeda members in Yemen. I find this very confusing. This is a very confusing foreign policy. Here's something else that's confusing. Why doesn't anybody in the mainstream media ask about that? Hey, we're arming the al-Qaeda rebels in Syria. We armed the al-Qaeda rebels in Libya. And yet, we're killing them in Yemen, and we're closing down embassies because we're afraid of an al-Qaeda threat. That's a bizarre policy. And also bizarre, the mainstream media ignores this obvious wart on our foreign policy. Speaking of Benghazi, speaking of the Middle East, Benghazi, that story is getting uglier and uglier. Now even, yes, the mainstream media is picking up on it. CNN, to their credit, is picking up on it. They are talking about a cover-up of some sort of an arms gun-running deal going from Libya to the Syrian rebels. Now, this story was brought up months ago by a website called WMD, a gun-running scheme from Libya to the Syrian rebels, which, remember, many months ago they were saying, oh, we're just giving them humanitarian aid. Well, looks like we weren't. Now, the State Department says that that's not true. We're not running guns to the Syrian rebels. But the evidence is mounting to the contrary, and even the mainstream media, CNN, my old employer, has picked up on it. Also, another development about Benghazi. Congressman Trey Gowdy, a Republican, is claiming the Obama administration is hiding Benghazi witnesses and changing their names and threatening their families. This is outrageous. Why would you do that if it was a phony scandal? Well, maybe it's not so phony. And finally, Obamacare is good for everybody but Congress. President Obama granted Congress and their staff a waiver to Obamacare. Also, the IRS. They don't want Obamacare either. They're asking for a waiver. Let me get this straight. The people who voted for it, Congress. The people who are supposed to enforce it, the IRS. They don't like it because they know it's a bad health care plan. But it's good enough for the taxpayers. It's good enough for us, but not good enough for the people who voted for it and who are implementing it. I don't see how that's not going to be a giant, colossal campaign issue in the midterm 2014 elections. Wait till this thing fully kicks in January of 2014. It is, if it's nothing else, an economy killer. That's the way I see it. Thank you for coming to the site and supporting it with your comments, and also for using the donations button. That helps us out. I'm Greg Hunter. That's the way I see it.